I guess in theory it's true that young people are more likely to mix than maybe ever before, more likely to know each other perhaps than ever before, more likely to bump into one another than ever before in the halls of their school, but none of that suggests equity.
I mean, diversity is just sort of a fact of life, you know. It's a scientific fact, it's a demographic fact, it's a social fact. I think what it means to me, though, in the context of a larger discussion about inequality, about injustice, about inequity, is usually it's a term that's used to avoid that deeper conversation. It usually is sort of a Band-Aid that we put on sort of an open sore of injustice, discrimination, inequality, racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, et cetera, rather than dealing with those real issues. So we'll have institutions talk about being more diverse, but they're not necessarily going to be more equitable. You know, they get people in the door, but are they really making sure that, you know, folks of color or working class kids who come to a college or university, are they really having an equitable experience? Are they treated equitably in the classroom?
That isn't evidence of equity or justice or a post-racial America, as some folks would have us believe. That's the kind of stuff we got to talk about.
I would definitely recommend this because I don't feel like diversity is something that's recognized in a lot of schools. People just don't think about it. And if someone were to come to this conference, they could get a better definition of it and they can get more insight on how to embrace diversity in their area or bring it to their area.
It's very educational, a lot of information you'll learn, and you're actually meeting a lot of people.
When you have a community that's 90% white, that first of all, that's not America anymore. I mean, it's just not. That's not what America looks like. Demographically, it's much whiter than the country as a whole. And I think that's going to end up in 10, 15, 20 years being really problematic. Not so much for people of color, though it'll be a problem for them too if they come through and they're really isolated and marginalized. But it's going to be a problem for the white folks because white folks in St. Cloud are not going to spend every waking moment of their lives in St. Cloud. They may not stay here. They may go elsewhere. And if they do, they're going to have to know how to interact with folks who are quite a bit different from what they consider normal. So I think when you grow up in these isolated spaces, you don't really know how to interact, you don't really know how to operate within a multicultural context, and in a 21st century America, it makes you sort of an anachronism, you know. But I think beyond that, you know, when I first came to St. Cloud, I remember having conversations with students of color who said, you know, even if the school does everything right in making us feel welcome, when we go shopping, when we go out to recreate on the weekends, when we are driving, you know, back to the Twin Cities to go out and do something that we think is fun, we're constantly under suspicion. We constantly feel like we're being followed and monitored, and they are. Racial profiling has been a problem in this community, as it has in others, not any more or less. But what that means is that the colleges that are isolated have to be doing outreach to the community. You know, the college can't do it all. The college can't do all the diversity programming and not bring in the K-12 schools, or do all the programming and not bring in the employers, or not bring in the civic organizations or the religious institutions. They all have to be involved in this process, because otherwise what you do is you might create a little oasis on a college campus, theoretically, where everybody's treated equitable, but then what about when you go off those campus grounds? You know, then all of a sudden you're being treated unequally again.
It really challenges you to question yourself and question other people and really learn more about just life in general and like learn other people's stories. Like I've probably learned more through this retreat and other retreats like it than I have, you know, in a couple months, just like everyday living.
I would recommend it because I think there's a lot to be learned from it. I think it facilitates the conversation about race that a lot of times people don't want to have, but that still needs to happen. And I think you're probably kidding yourself if you think there's nothing for you to learn here. So
I will tell you that what I do see that's different is that, you know, we're having this conference where we're really talking about these issues in a pretty in-depth way, and bringing in some incredible speakers and different events all this week, and that kind of dialogue, that kind of real high-level dialogue involving students from all over, is something I didn't see when I first came 11 or 12 years ago. At that time, the isolation was far greater, I think. The conversation was at a much lower level. So just the fact that the school's doing this, and of course I know the context within which this is happening. I mean, there have been a litany of racial incidents in this community and at this school, a history of institutional racism that was confirmed by 2 or 3 independent audits, none of which the university wanted to accept as being true, even though they hired the auditors. So I realized that given that history, there may have been some pressure to have this conference, but that's fine. You know, whether they would have done it without the problems or not, they're doing it. And the people who are putting it on I think are going to make a real difference in this institution, and I hope that it continues, you know, strong into the future.